The movie opens with a white car driving up a driveway of an old mansion. In the car, there is a young boy and a woman who is smoking a cigarette. The car stops in front of the mansion, and the boy and the woman come out. As the boy looks up, he sees a man looking at him. They are greeted by a lady named Mrs. Clark. She says that she has been looking after their grandfather and his house. We learn that the woman's name is Margot and the boy's name is Blake. Mrs. Clark also says that Blake's grandfather told her a lot about him until he got sick. She tells them to come up and have a look at their grandfather. Blake and his mother enter the house. It is a spooky-looking mansion, and Margot follows Mrs. Clark up the stairs, whereas Blake takes a look around. As he looks around, Margot calls Blake to come with her. Both of them follow Mrs. Clark to the attic, where the grandfather is resting. All three of them enter the attic room, and we see Mr. Clement on the bed, unconscious, and has an oxygen cylinder to help him breathe. Blake holds his grandfather, Mr. Clement's hand. Mrs. Clark says that Mr. Clement did not bounce back from the stroke this time, and he has been this way for a week. She also says that the nurse left because she thought Mr. Clement was scary and creepy. Mrs. Clark tells Margot that she is their last resort to look after Mr. Clement. Margot asks Mrs. Clark if her father has said anything, but Mrs. Clark says he has been unconscious and that his mental health is deteriorating. Also, his speech is not coherent. Blake asks Mrs. Clark if his grandfather can hear them, but she says that they do not know yet. Hearing all the conversation, Margot shows an insensitive attitude towards Mr. Clement, as she believes he has not shown her enough love. Later, Mrs. Clark shows Blake and his mother their respective rooms. Blake rocks the rocking chair in his room and goes out into the lobby. A toy train comes out of nowhere, and Blake goes to see it. He looks here and there to see the source from where it came out. As he looks at the train, Mrs. Clark tells him that he can have it if he wants, but Margot tells him to leave it. Later, Mrs. Clark leaves the mansion. Blake and Margot share a heartfelt conversation. Margot tells Blake that she was never fond of the house. However, Blake says that he loves it. In the next scene, Blake and Margot are seen standing in the grandfather's room. Margot says that her father was a secretive man and drove her mother crazy, but Blake does not agree with it and says that they should be nice to him as his grandfather was always kind. It is also revealed that Margot and Blake are here because Margot is having financial issues and they need a place to stay. After a while, Blake unpacks his bag. As he puts his clothes in the cupboard, he sees chalk fallen on the floor. Then, Blake goes to explore the house and comes across the huge library of his grandfather. As he looks at the books, he comes across an old photo album which has pictures of him as a boy. Meanwhile, Margot, who is also an alcoholic, goes down to the basement to get liquor for herself. As she pours herself a glass of wine, she hears Blake play the violin. She goes up to him, where Blake points out that Margot had promised she will not drink. Margot justifies her drinking as her settling in. At night, while sitting beside the fireplace, Margot tells Blake that his father will be visiting them the next day. She tells him to pretend to love the house and that they are well settled. Also that they do not need his support to survive. Blake agrees to do so and tells Margot to go to bed, but she insists on sitting near the frame. After Blake goes to bed, he is awakened by the sound of a violin. He goes outside to see who is playing the violin. As he enters the room, he sees a bald boy in the mirror playing the violin. Suddenly, Blake is terrified by an unusual-looking boy. It is revealed that Blake had been dreaming. He wakes up from the dream, breathing heavily. He hears a creak and goes out of the room. He sees his mother snoring on the couch and talking in her sleep. He goes into the room where he was playing the violin in the evening. He sees that his violin is in the place where he left it. He comes back to the living room and puts a blanket on his mother. He picks up the glasses and the bottle of wine and takes it to the kitchen. While going back to his room, he hears strange voices coming from his grandfather's room. He goes up to his room and hears a man talking to his grandfather, saying that he does not want to pass away and wants his mother back. Blake tries to open the door by pushing it, but it is locked. As he pushes it harder, the door opens, but he sees nobody inside. Suddenly, the door slams shut and Blake tries to open it. With extreme force, Blake is able to open the door. When Blake leaves the room, we see his grandfather getting up from the bed. Once Blake leaves, the toy train comes out from under the bed. The next day, Blake's father comes to visit them. Margot opens the door for him, and both of them argue. Meanwhile, Blake looks for his violin, which goes missing from the case. As his parents are arguing, Blake comes in and meets his father. He asks his mother about his violin's whereabouts, but she says she does not know where it is. Margot tells Blake to heat the water in a kettle to make tea. Blake goes to the kitchen and starts to fill the kettle with water. While filling the water in the kettle, he looks outside and sees a man with long hair standing outside. He tries to look closely, but is unable to do so. His attention diverts as he burns his hand from the hot water. As he draws his hand away from the hot tap, he cleans the window to have a clear view, but this time he sees no one outside. Blake runs outside to clear his confusion and goes to the greenhouse. He looks across and sees the person with long hair, but the person runs away. He comes across his broken violin in the greenhouse and becomes suspicious. Back at home, his mother and father are arguing when Blake brings them tea. He asks his mother if they are the only ones living there. His mother confirms that they are the only ones there. After a while, Blake goes to the library. While looking at the books, he comes across a tape recorder. He plugs in the tape recorder and plays it. It has a recording of his grandfather talking about paranormal activity at their house. As he is listening to the recording, Blake's father knocks on the door. Later on, we see Blake's father leave. It is revealed that Blake's parents are not married, whereas Margot wanted to get married to him. At night, Margot plays a song on the radio. She and Blake enjoy their time dancing and laughing. As they enjoy their time, Aubrey, grandfather of Blake, has a seizure. As the seizure ends, we hear footsteps and the door of his room open. The invisible person comes down the stairs and goes into Blake's room. He sits on the armchair and rocks it. Meanwhile, in the living room, Blake argues with his mother about her drinking problem. He tells his mother that he wants her back and that she should throw all the bottles of wine away. Blake leaves the room, and Margot goes and throws the glass of wine in the sink and also empties the bottle. Late at night, Blake again has a weird dream involving his grandfather, the bald man in the rocking chair. He also sees a hammer falling from the top. As he sees his grandfather come to him in the dream, he wakes up. Blake gets out of bed and goes out of his room to hear the taping recorder playing his grandfather's recording. He switches it off and is about to leave the library when the tape recorder starts playing again. He again switches it off and is about to leave when it starts to play again. However, this time when he goes to switch it off, he is in for a surprise. A hand comes up, and it turns out his grandfather is there asking for help from him. Blake starts to cry and screams for his mother. The next day, Mrs. Clark comes in, running to the house to see Aubrey. Margot and Blake ask her about Aubrey walking, when she had told them he could not do it. Then Mrs. Clark looks at Aubrey's hand moving. Blake says it looks as if he is writing, but Mrs. Clark calls it a muscle spasm and dismisses Blake. After a while, Mrs. Clark is about to leave when Blake asks her about the previous nurse. He asks Mrs. Clark about the reason for the nurse leaving and the reason for her leaving without her belongings. Mrs. Clark then clarifies that the nurse did not leave but disappeared and never returned. Margot gets upset upon hearing this, but Mrs. Clark apologizes for being dishonest. She says she had to do it for the welfare of Mr. Clement. Once Mrs. Clark leaves, Blake and Margot have an intense conversation. Blake says that he feels that there is some supernatural cause of his grandfather's illness. He also believes the missing nurse is suspicious. Blake asks his mother about Aubrey's work and tells her that he has been listening to his recording. However, Margot dismisses Blake and tells him not to look for logic in all of this. She believes she made a mistake bringing him to Clement's house. In the evening, Blake goes to Aubrey's room, whose hand is still moving. Blake locks the door and puts a piece of paper underneath his grandfather's hand and hands him a pencil. Aubrey sketches on the paper and keeps on drawing it. At that moment, Margot is in the kitchen when she sees a shadow in the pendulum of the clock. As she looks at the water, she screams because it looks like blood. She goes to check the water again, and this time it is water. It seems as if she is imagining it. As she catches her breath, Blake comes in and shows the papers to her mother. Since Margot is afraid of the incident, she tells Blake that the drawings on the paper are scribbles. When Blake's mother does not believe him, he goes to his grandfather's library. He takes out all the books on witchcraft and starts to read them. He comes across the story of the Three Kings. Meanwhile, Margot is seen sitting in the kitchen, smoking a cigarette. She tries to look at the sketch and make sense of it. As she tries to understand, the drawing a bottle of wine rolls in. She goes out of the kitchen to see if someone is there. She gets afraid and closes the door of the basement. After closing the door, she turns around and catches the glimpse of the map of the house on the wall. She realizes it is the same as the drawing created by Aubrey. She takes the map on the wall to Blake. He puts it on the window and places the paper over it, and the drawing fits perfectly. It turns out it is the map of the house. Blake asks his mother about a room in the basement, but his mother tells him there is no room other than the wine cellar. Both Blake and Margot go to the basement, but Margot refuses to go down. Blake goes down alone, but does not find anything. At night, we see Blake listening to his grandfather's recordings again. He falls asleep and has the same dream involving his grandfather, the chair, the bald man, and the hammer falling from the ceiling. Suddenly, he wakes up and switches off the recorder. Every time he would switch off the tape recorder, the chair would start to rock and Blake gets scared. Then, he hears a knock on the door. He gets up to check, but sees nobody there. He again closes the door, but it opens again, and this time a hand creeps up the door. Blake grabs a box of matchsticks and lights a candle, seeing a ghost with a weird face. Blake screams. He closes the door, sits on the floor, and starts to cry. The next day, Blake again goes down to the basement. He looks around and ends up finding an entrance. He uses a hammer to break the door and goes in. At that moment, Margot looks outside the window and sees three ghosts wearing headgear and white clothes. She screams and runs outside, but does not find anything. As she is trying to look around, the door of the house gets locked and she remains outside. Back in the basement, Blake comes across a picture and a film reel in the secret room. He also finds bones in the room and screams. Meanwhile, Margot tries to find a way into the house. After finding the reel, Blake plays it using the projector. As the movie plays, Blake starts to cry. Outside the house, Margot ends up at the church and cries. She imagines Blake's father being there and calling her with a smile. After a while, Margot returns home and finds a bundle on the table. As she tries to check it out, Blake tells her that they are human bones. Blake tells his mother to see the reel to find out what his grandfather did. They play the reel, and in it we see Aubrey slitting a boy's throat whose face is destroyed. He has 3 other people with him, similar to those Margot saw from the window. All of them drink the blood of the boy. Margot feels disgusted by the reel and switches off the projector. Blake tells Margot that he has seen this boy in the house. His name is Jacob, and he is still here in the house. Blake also says that Jacob is punishing Aubrey for the deed. Blake tells his mother that they should bury the bones. Later, Blake comes across his mother talking to someone on the phone. She cries and apologizes to Blake for bringing him into this mess. She tells Blake to leave, but Blake denies her and says he wants to stay with her. He also says that they should bury the bones to get rid of Jacob. Both of them carry the bones to the ground to bury them. Jacob starts to dig the grave when he sees a woman in the bushes. They drag the woman to the house, who pleads with them not to take her to the house. Back at the house, Margot gives the woman a cup of tea to calm her nerves. Blake recognizes the woman to be the same one from the greenhouse. He also recognizes the woman to be the nurse who disappeared. Margot questions her for leaving her father in such a state. The nurse speaks up that she could not stay in the house that night. She tells them that Aubrey was acting strange and always talking to himself. She also tells them that there was also someone else in the house who used to speak back to Aubrey. She tells Blake and Margot that whenever she used to sleep, the chair would rock. It meant that the supernatural thing was watching her. She also says that initially, it was a glimpse, and then one day, she saw the awful face. She says she knew it was there all along. While the nurse relates her incident, Blake and Margot remember their weird encounters in the house. Then, Blake tells her that the name of the boy is Jacob. The nurse confirms the presence of Jacob in the house and asks if they have already seen him. Blake tells her that it's only glimpses, and Margot explains that the boy was murdered in this house. The nurse also thinks that Jacob occupies Aubrey's body, and now since Aubrey is so ill, Jacob is looking for another living body. She says she has heard them talk, but Blake and Margot deny Aubrey talking. Hearing this, the nurse says that she can prove it to them. All 3 of them go up to the attic room, and the nurse screams at Aubrey to speak, but he does not. The nurse takes out a knife to cut Aubrey's arm, and suddenly he starts to talk, but it is not Aubrey. It turns out it is Jacob in Aubrey's body. Jacob says that Aubrey has been gone for a while, and he is waiting for his mother to find him a body as he is too young to pass away. He also explains that Blake is the one who will help Jacob, and that Jacob's mother tricked them into coming to Clement's house. Margot gets scared and asks about the one who tricked them, but Jacob does not tell her. Blake guesses it to be Mrs. Clark, but the nurse is surprised to hear her name. She asks Blake and Margot who Mrs. Clark is. Margot tells her that Mrs. Clark is the nurse who visits weekly and was sent by the agency in place of her. It is revealed that Mrs. Clark is no nurse. She is Jacob's mother, and she planned to lure Blake here to save Jacob. When Margot hears this, all of them run down the stairs to escape from the house. Blake goes into his room to pack his bag. When he looks at the pictures of him and his grandfather, all of them have Jacob in them. This starts to freak out Blake. Meanwhile, Margot runs out of the house to stop Mrs. Clark, but she is too late. When she comes back to the house, it is locked. She shouts and tells the nurse that Mrs. Clark has already entered the house. As soon as the nurse turns around, Mrs. Clark is standing there. She hits the nurse with a hammer. After the nurse's demise, Mrs. Clark calls for Jacob and ascends the stairs. Seeing all this, Blake runs for his life, but encounters Jacob and the 3 other ghosts. Blake starts to scream, and as he runs for his life, he is caught by Mrs. Clark. Mrs. Clark drags him down to the basement. Blake resists, but is unable to fight Mrs. Clark. After Mrs. Clark drags Blake down to the basement, there are candles lit down there. She tells Blake that she loves Jacob, and she never told Aubrey to take his soul away from the body. Also, Jacob needs to be in Blake's body to continue to live. Blake cries and pleads with her to let him go, but she takes out scissors. She cuts and takes out Blake's blood and pours it into the candles. Then, she throws him into the secret room. Blake keeps on crying for help, but nobody is there to help him. Mrs. Clark starts to use witchcraft for Jacob to assume control of Blake's body. As she recites the word, Jacob's soul starts to move towards Blake, and he is unable to breathe. Meanwhile, Margot enters the house and screams upon seeing the nurse's body. Further, the 3 ghosts with slithering tongues scare her. She runs to the basement and hits Mrs. Clark with the hammer, breaking the spell. She releases Blake, and both run to save their lives. As they go up the stairs, Mrs. Clark wakes up and screams for Jacob, but Margot manages to capture her by closing the basement door. She tells Blake to run for his life. As Jacob runs, he also sees the 3 ghosts and runs away crying. Once Mrs. Clark is distracted, Margot takes bottles of wine and goes to the attic room. Unluckily, Mrs. Clark follows her upstairs with the hammer. Margot goes to her father's room and sprinkles the wine on him, and then lights a matchstick, burning him and Jacob. Mrs. Clark follows the fire as well, thinking of Jacob standing there. She drops the hammer from the top, but Blake saves himself before getting hit by it. Seeing the fire, Blake runs upstairs and is united with his mother. The next day, Blake and Margot leave the house. Margot says that they shall be selling the house soon. As Blake sits in the car, he sees Aubrey and his face up in the window. It seems as if Jacob has possessed Blake. The movie ends with them riding away with Blake's father in the car.